I'll just see if we can get things going. Right. We've lost a slide. So before I get going, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement to country that we acknowledge this land that we meet on today is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we pay respect to their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of Adelaide region, and their cultural heritage beliefs are still important to the living Kaurna people today. And we also pay respects to the Cultural Authority of Aboriginal people visiting, attending from other areas of South Australia and Australia. We are very excited to be here at Adelaide Oval today because we are putting together a concussion workshop that we've been talking about for years, to be honest. It is very much going to be, even though it looks like it's a Brownlow medal count in terms of the layout, this is going to be very much a practical workshop where we've got some excellent guest speakers, we've got some people with a lot of clinical knowledge. So first and foremost, we will have, this morning we'll have Professor John Patricios as our keynote, dialing in from Johannesburg. We're very grateful to John because it's 2 o'clock in the morning that he'll be dialing in, so we're thankful to him. This morning we'll have Luke Ivens, who's going to give us a personal story, which is very impactful and very personal, and it gives us real perspective as to why we're here today, particularly when addressing persistent issues of mild traumatic brain injury. We have Dr. Julia Treleaven here, who will be talking to us and doing some practical workshop with us this afternoon around the cervical spine. Tania Straga is an orthoptist with lots of experience in terms of binocular vision. We're very lucky to have her here in Adelaide to help us with our patients with concussion and brain injury. We've got Liz Jempson-Ledger, who's the clinical lead physiotherapist at Advanced Neuro Rehab. I'm very lucky to be working with Liz. Liz is super passionate in trying to get multi-D networking and has been involved in education and concussion very heavily in the past couple of years. We've got Nicole Eglinton and Lauren Eisen-Zarino from All Ears, who will be giving us some practical information about audiology, speech pathology. Their services also involve psychology, but really about audiological processing, which is a very interesting area, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot from them. We have Dr. David Stevens from Neuroflex, who's going to talk to us about some of the tech, and we'll have some other bits of technology as well to really understand technology that's actually making an impact, and we're actually using it, which will be driving excellence in the whole area of concussion assessments. And then last, you've got me. And I've been involved in concussion for a long time in terms of our clinical work in vestibular and neurological rehab, but in the past couple of years, particularly involved through Your Brain Health around education and clinical support with the whole idea of implementing change. And I'm sure we'll get an opportunity to talk about some of the things that we've been doing this afternoon. Before I hand over to Luke, we'll just summarise some of the really exciting things about this kind of workshop is the fact it's one of the rare opportunities we get to mix together. We've got neurology, we've got sports, we've got ophthalmology, we've got psychology, audiology, musculoskeletal, vestibular, all in the same room, all learning about concussion and driving each other further. It's not often, as a neurological physiotherapist, I get to talk to sports physios, we get to talk about performance, we get to talk about vestibular rehab, but this is a really nice opportunity that we get to hang out together. And also, because of the experienced clinicians talking to us today, we're going to have an amazing opportunity to get a lot of clinical insights that are, yes, we know about the guidelines and there's been a lot produced over the last few years, but we're going to get the real clinical pearls, the sort of interesting stuff. So if you see anything mysterious or unusual, just enjoy it while you can, because you're going to get some strange opinions, you're going to get some really new ideas, stuff that's not going to be in the textbooks, and stuff that we've been doing for a long time, to be honest, that only just come into the textbooks. So it's really nice to get the clinical expertise here today. The schedule is, once I've jumped off the stage, we're going to have Luke give his personal journey, and then at 9:45 we're going to have Professor John Patricios calling in from South Africa to give us an update on concussion in sport. John was the lead author in the most recent consensus statement from Amsterdam in 2022. Then we've got Tania Straga talking to us about binocular vision and visual issues with concussion. Morning tea, and then we have a practical where we've got both the opportunity to think about vision and audiology. After lunch, we've got Julia talking to us about cervical spine and whiplash, really helping us understand that cervical spine is not just an add-on now with concussion, it's an integral part of concussion management. And I'll be showing with some tips and tricks around vestibular assessment in this particular population. And it's going to be very much a practical aspect after that, where we can demonstrate some of our clinical assessments, lots of opportunity for Q&As to be able to answer, but major opportunity to demonstrate and give you some tips that you can use tomorrow with your, except you're all here at the conference, won't you? But maybe on Friday you'll use it when you see your patients. After afternoon tea, we've got a bit of a tech demo where we've got lots of bits of technology here that we use. This is technology that we use every day. This is the stuff that is not the future, it's actually being used right now. So we'll share how we're using that, and it's a unique opportunity for us to have experienced clinicians say how technology is making our lives easier. And then to wrap up, if any of you are still left here, we'll just do a reflection, because it's a really interesting point in concussion care right now, where we are, got really good questions for researchers. We've got really clear directions that we want to know as clinicians. And so I think 2024 will be an interesting time where I think there'll be a lot of growth and expansion in this particular field. What's new? We've got new definitions that we have for concussion. We've got guidelines that have come out the last few years, which are excellent. We've got a different attitude now about rest and early interventions. We've got new technologies that that are using. We have a greater appreciation of persisting symptoms, the 25% of people who have persisting symptoms 4 weeks post-concussion, and how we can hopefully save some of those people from becoming more chronic. And then we've got new research priorities because of what we'll be discussing. Concussion, in terms of, just to remind you, it's not mild if you've got loss of consciousness for over 30 minutes, and after 30 minutes, if your Glasgow Coma scale is less than 13, and if your PTA, post-traumatic amnesia, is greater than 24 hours, it's not mild, so we'll be talking moderate severe brain injury in those situations. But this is where it gets confusing for us all. What do we call concussion? What do we call mild TBI? Well, there's two categories. Mild TBI can be with abnormal neuroimaging, which at this stage is most cases with concussion, or you can have, you have normal imaging in most situations. If you have normal imaging, or it's not indicated by our clinical assessments, then that's where we can be interchanged with the word concussion and mild TBI. So it's still a little bit confusing for the general public, but the whole idea today is we're talking about concussion, mild TBI. There's been some guidelines. It seems like forever. February 2024 this came out. God, it feels like years this came out because we've been examining it. But the Australian Institute of Sport came out with guidelines which were excellent, an excellent resource, certainly highlighted a few important aspects. And we've got coming soon the Australian-New Zealand Clinical Practice Guidelines. Julie, you're involved in that. Is it not quite here yet? Must be very close. So we'll have some more guidelines that we can review and refer to. The highlights from the AIS guidelines are around the 14 days symptom-free before returning to contact training, a 21-day minimum return to play in sports following concussion. The introduction of a concussion officer for over the next few years, that'll be new for a lot of organisations and clubs and businesses in terms of allocating and training concussion officers. The whole idea of conservative management for those with recurrent concussions, so 2 concussions within 3 months is something that we act differently. If you have 3 within 12 months, then it's a 28-day symptom-free before returning with a minimum 6 weeks off since concussion. And then there's a bit more of a prioritisation, which we like in terms of return to learn or before return to play, and to do these things in parallel with our students, our school and university students, which often get concussed. There's changes happening in the whole idea of prevention, preparation. Education has certainly come a long way in the last few years. with still lots of talks about risk reduction, things like sports rules and things like that. Baseline screening is more than emerging now. It's becoming more commonplace and part of recommended practice, which makes sense. In the acute management, identification of red flags, the diagnostic aspects, the monitoring aspects, the recommendations we give people with acute, early interventions, brief rest now. We are really pushing for 24 to 40 hours of relative rest, but not really much longer than that. Early assessment and early referrals, earlier than ever before, we think is becoming really important. Proactive interventions that we want to get in early, which we'll talk about some of those. And the use of return to plans, return to learn and return to play. And they are structured protocols now that are relatively simple to follow. Early assessments, we're trying to get everything earlier, earlier rehabilitation to get to the skilled people, and then really get onto this multi-D approach, which is why we're all here today. And then ongoing care and rehab, there's going to be some people that will need the multi-D rehab, they'll need the brain injury rehabilitation. Hopefully they've started that process because they're already seeing the right people. Care plans, disability support, all these things become an important part of our conversations. There's a lot of excitement around early interventions, particularly sub-threshold aerobic exercise. As you know, some of you will definitely know that Barry Wheeler was a keynote speaker here at this brain injury conference a few years back. A lot of work's happened around this idea of getting people doing aerobic exercise early on, particularly in athletes. This is a picture of me in the NFL Academy in Loughborough in the UK earlier this year. We met the research group there that just have recently published some work around commencing within 48 hours of a concussion with athletes sub-threshold aerobic exercise with benefits. So we really do wonder whether spreading the word, getting a little bit more proactive early on, particularly with athletes, can be a very good thing for concussion. And so it's quite a significant breakthrough to know that it's safe to do these kinds of things. There's heaps we can talk about today, and unfortunately we've only got a day, we don't have a week. But mental health after concussion is huge. Sleep is a big issue that we could spend another day or two talking about. Cognition is particularly important. Neurocognitive screens, although they've become less fashionable lately, are still an important part of the multimodal assessments and an important part of our referral process. Post-traumatic headache, I've got a particular interest in that area, how that's evolving over time. But unfortunately, while we will discuss some of those things today, it won't be part of our huge content. We will be talking about vision, won't we, Tania? We'll be talking a lot about that. Auditory processing, for sure. We've got cervical spine, very well covered. Vestibular dysfunction, and I think you'll get the sense of how cervical spine and vestibular really do go hand in hand with our management now. The use of technology, not just to do it, but just to think how do we interpret what that technology is showing us. And then think about some other technologies. We've got some balance technologies, we've got some heart rate variability technologies, which I'm wearing the First Beat Tech right now, so we'll see how stressed I actually am as I'm talking to you. We've got some other multimodal aspects and some software that we'd like to show you that we think is really going to improve our efficiency and our quality of our multimodal report writing. John, we're very lucky, he'll be talking to us. Now, I might just do a brief introduction to John because of time, may be an issue a bit later on, but John, as Head of Concussion Sport South Africa, we've been lucky to be involved in the last few years. He's been really good to gather advice around the whole issue of concussion in sport. He's also a professor at Wits University, and he's also been lead author, as I said, in terms of the concussion in sport group and the consensus statement that came out in 2022, which is a really important reference point for us all. Even if you're not involved in sport, we keep coming back to those guidelines as a good reference point. So John will be joining us at 9:45. That's why we've been pushing everyone in to get started today. But we're very lucky that we've got Luke Ivens now to give us his personal journey. I won't say too much because Luke will explain his own story, but it's an excellent idea from everything from sports all the way through to living your life and managing some of these issues. So I'm very pleased to introduce Luke to tell his personal journey. So thank you to Luke. There's your thing.
Yeah, it's a green.
Yeah, just push, that will change it for you. Thank
Cool.
you. There you go.
Cool, thank you, James. Thanks for having me here today. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak to you this morning. I certainly can't give you any clinical information, but hopefully my personal journey might help set the scene for the day. I'll tell you a bit more about the foundation, but I've become an ambassador for the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and in 2022 I started talking at sporting clubs. So I spoke at 30 different sporting clubs, mainly football clubs, that year, and then this year I started presenting at school sports, so like their winter launches, and spoke to the National Schools Conference too. So I'm trying to get out to sporting clubs and now schools to speak to our youth as well. I've also teamed up with Your Brain Health. They join me on a lot of talks to bring that clinical side, because obviously I've got the personal journey side, and it's really important to have that clinical side too when we're speaking. My talk to clubs is definitely not from like a fear factor about playing contact sport. I'm coming from a football base. It's more about just really managing concussion safety and just looking after the well-being of our young athletes too. So I come from a place of passion for sport. I've got 3 young boys, and I'd love them to play football. They can choose whatever sport they want, but I'm definitely not coming from a place of anti-sport or anti-contact sport. Just really emphasise the fact to please be safe if you are unlucky enough to have a concussion. So I played 194 games for North Adelaide in the SANFL from the years 2000 to 2013. I had 6 coaches along that journey. Started with Chris McDermott, had Darryl Hart, then it was Andrew Jarman. He was my coach for 5 years, so had a lot of success with Andrew Jarman. Then it was Josh Franco, Daniel Healy, and then finished up with Ken McGregor. So saw a few coaches in my day, but I felt very lucky to play that amount of games and years at North Adelaide Footy Club. It really shaped my identity and developed traits such as resilience and discipline and teamwork. So I look back on my career with lots of fond memories. I was pretty lucky in terms of injuries. I broke my ankle when I was 18. Started having a lot of soft tissue injuries later on in my career. I had to retire because of hamstrings, so I was pretty lucky in that regard. But I had a lot of concussions. Just thinking this morning, I was trying to think of my first concussion. It didn't come till I was 16. I was playing in a trial match with the under-17s in North Adelaide, and just a big bump in the middle of the field. And I remember waking up and my mother was on the field. She was leaving to America the next day, so I just woke up and luckily it was a trial match because she was on the field like, what the hell are you doing, Mum? Please get off the field. She was a bit worried about her son having to leave for America the next day. And then when I was 21, I had 5 concussions in the same year. I was a tagger. I started off as a tagger as a young kid wanting to make their mark in SANFL. And back then, this was 2001, it was... there was no, you weren't frowned upon if you took out the tagger and, a few head-high hits. Not sure if you know the name Damien Squire, but he was playing his 250th game for Sturt. He was a Sturt legend here in the SANFL, and I was tagging him, and at half-time I'd done a pretty good job, and they obviously decided, we're not going to let this young kid ruin his 250th, so I reckon it must have been about 2 minutes into the third quarter. I was taken out pretty heavily, so that was my 3rd concussion for the year. But we didn't know much back then, and I'd just keep playing, fronting up the next week, and I certainly don't look back on any resentment because the education just wasn't there like we know now. And I had 5 concussions, but at the end of that year, I'd just get a decent bump. I'd be seeing stars, and you see on the AFL players get a bit wobbly. I suppose that's how I was, but I'd just stay on, and once again, just didn't know the ramifications and the effects it was having on me. And you know, you'd go out having a few drinks after too, and you know, I just look back and you think, oh God, what the hell was I doing? But you just don't think of that. You know, I'm a 20, 21-year-old kid, and I just loved playing league footy, and I just wanted to play every game. I remember one game, well, I probably had about 20 concussions after that throughout my career. And I remember one, I reckon I was about 22, I'd had a concussion, and it came to a Thursday night, and I was not right. I shouldn't be playing, and I went to take a mark, and I just fell over going to take the mark, and Andrew John was like, "What are you doing, Luke? Are you all right?" And I just pretended I'd tripped over, but I just wanted to play, and and I played the game, and definitely didn't play a great game. I was just very blurry vision and nauseous, but didn't think too much of it. Just I suppose I thought, I was probably still having a few symptoms, but just didn't think of I suppose the damage I was doing at the time. Probably the most brutal concussion came when I was 23 years old. I was a half-back flanker, and I don't think I was the most skilled player, but I prided myself on just running in straight lines and just hitting hard at the contest. And one of my teammates took a mark on the back flank, and I just sprinted to the wing, and I can't remember, but the vision shows it was a hospital ball, and the vision shows me colliding with a centre forward, and just my head smacked straight into his elbow, and I woke up about 7 minutes later, taken the hospital. Felt pretty ordinary the first couple of days, but once again played the next week too. So and whenever I tell that story at sporting clubs and schools, everyone goes, "Oh God!" But once again, this is going back to 2003, so didn't think any of it, and I really want to still emphasise that I do not hold any resentment against any of the medical staff, any of the crew at North Adelaide. It was, the education wasn't there. And I've also been asked, would I ever, go down the route of, getting involved in the Royal Commission and whatnot, and the answer straight away is absolutely not. My mission is to raise awareness and use my story as a powerful tool to just, think about the ramifications, if you don't take concussions seriously. And once again, I really emphasise that it's not a fear factor. We know so much more about concussions now, and our young children and our young athletes are in so much better hands with you guys in the room and the work you are doing. So I suppose I come from a place of appreciation for how far we've come now, and events like this makes me feel really comfortable and really happy knowing that I've got 3 young boys who I think sport's going to be a big part of their life, and knowing that they're going to be in really safe hands. So I suppose I do say thank you for all the work you guys are doing too. So I finished up my career at Urade. I had a few teammates who, this is at Adelaide Hills, a local club in the Adelaide Hills. I wore a helmet, from the age of 22. That was after those 5 concussions. The doctor said to me, either you wear a helmet or you're going to have to retire. And obviously at 22 years old, there was no way I was retiring. So that became part of my uniform for the rest of my career. And I finished up at around, it would have been about 35, 36. And I'm not sure if it was a coincidence, but when I finished up playing, I started having some symptoms that was really unknown to me, and I hadn't had anything like this before. First came real bad social anxiety. I started being the player coach of the team, and I found myself not even wanting to walk into the club to do presentations. I felt so heightened, socially heightened and anxious about just walking to the club, and it was really debilitating. I'm a school teacher too, and I found myself really so anxious about walking to the classroom, and it was really really confusing for me, because I've always been a pretty outgoing guy, and I pride myself on connections and relationships. That's why I become a teacher as well, and it was really a pretty hard time, because I didn't know what the hell was going on. Then headaches started coming too. Once again, really debilitating headaches, which would last for various amounts of time. And also noticed my short-term memory, just couldn't retain things. And I became a deputy at a school, and people would be asking me questions about yard duties and just things throughout the day, and I just couldn't retain any of the information. I do cook as well, but my wife, I couldn't remember what my wife was cooking me the night before. It was a really, it kind of all come all of a sudden, I feel like. But when I look back now, it was kind of like a bit of a gradual build-up, this social anxiety, the headaches. And I didn't connect it with the concussions. I went on a bit of a rabbit hole of searching for answers and jumping to specialists and doctors, and I couldn't get any answers, and I felt like my life was kind of falling apart, and I didn't want to be in my own head, to be honest. James mentioned mental health before, and from 2019 to 2021, my mental health was absolutely shot. I started self-medicating on alcohol. It's always hard to tell this part, because I had a little young boy at the time, and I was drinking to blackout, and trying to wake up and be a good father in those periods was, I couldn't look myself in the mirror. I pride myself on being a really good person and a good husband and a good dad, and I certainly wasn't being that at that time. But I just didn't want to be in my own head, and I suppose you could say a bit weak, but I chose alcohol just to suppress my feelings and escape what was going on with me. It came to probably, I reckon, early 2021, and my life was falling apart. Like I was going to lose my family, I was going to lose my job. I was probably going to lose my life. My mum actually said to me, like, you had a lot of concussions, why don't you go, down the path of just getting some scans and whatnot. And got a series of scans, went to an Adelaide-based neurologist, and they referred me immediately to Rowena Mobbs in Sydney, a CT specialist. The neurologist said to me, and I always, this won't leave me. He said, your brain looks like a car crash victim. You need to get some specialist help. So I had some different tests and had some consultations with Rowena Mobbs, and coupled with my symptoms and the scans, she diagnosed me with probable CTE, and that was at the start of probably midway through 2021, and from there, all I could think about then was how Shane Tuck finished up and Danny Frawley, and I spiralled out of control again, to be honest. My mental health probably declined even more. I was in the space already where I didn't really want to be here or be in my head, and getting that news really made me spiral again. So my drinking ramped up again. It was just pretty horrendous time, to be honest. And I rang Rowena Moz. I remember one Monday morning, I just was absolutely desperate, and I said, like, something's got to give here. Like I'm basically said, I'm just about to, like, you know, not be here, like, I'm bloody desperate. And there was two things she did, which you think, well, that's pretty simple, but it really changed my life around, and that's why I'm, you know, being able to do what I do now and be able to speak here with you guys. And she's put me on some medication, so that really helped me stabilise my headaches, helped my social anxiety. There's no way I'd be able to speak to you guys now if this was a couple of years ago with my social anxiety, so we've got that under control. I've just learnt strategies to deal with my short-term memory. My desk at work's filled with sticky notes. Every time I think of something, I'll just send myself an email to myself, like, just to remind me. So I really, to be honest, I've learned how to function really, like, at a high level now, just putting these strategies in place. So, you know, I feel like I'm in a really good place with work and how I'm functioning. And the other thing she said, which was so minor, but I think it was so powerful, she said, like, you actually don't know if you've got CTE. Like, you don't, you know, you obviously can't know that until post-mortem, and just live your life like you've got, you know, diabetes and a condition where you've just got to manage yourself. And just that simple statement just has really turned my life around. And from that point, I put some things in place to get my life back on track. And I'm really proud to say now that, you know, I am a good husband and I'm a good father. I've got three boys now. And, you know, and I suppose the reason why I'm so passionate about this, I feel so bloody lucky that I found out what was going on and that I could manage myself. I was going down obviously a really dark path, and but you don't know how grateful I am to be able to speak to you guys about this and to be able to know how to manage my symptoms. So my life now, I've got a bit of a daily routine. Like, I have to exercise each day. Like, that kind of makes me buoyant and makes me, you know, function to my best ability. Like, I know if I don't get up and go for a run, or if I don't, you know, do some swimming, I know that's just part of my day. You know, people meditate, people, you know, start their day, you know, lots of different ways. I know that keeps me, that makes me, you know, gives me my energy to start the day. Obviously, I take medication. I don't drink anymore. There's just, yeah, I kind of, you know, like Maureen and Mob said, diabetes, they take insulin. I know how to make myself function to the best ability. And I suppose brain injuries are all different, all complex, and I feel lucky that I know how to manage my symptoms as well. You know, I've found medication that works for me. I know people that unfortunately they're still struggling with that. People have had some concussion injuries, but I feel very, very lucky that I've got myself on a really, really positive path. Just a few things that I'm doing. I've got myself back in footy, so I'm coaching the local footy team, Mitcham Hawks. I live around the corner from Mitcham, which is a local Adelaide suburb. I actually won the grand final this year, so that was I'd never actually won a grand final as a player or coach, so that was pretty cool at the age of 40. So I've got myself, I'm training up for an Ironman, so that's next year. So I'm just putting all positive things in my life now, because I know that's, to be honest, my passion's for my family. It was so hard, it's really hard to say what I did about the effect on my family, and I'll never forget that. But everything I do now is for my family, and you know, putting these things in place is my motivation is my family and my boys. They mean everything to me, and it'll always make me my heart almost break out of my chest when I go back to that place where I was, you know, when I could, you know, I was waking up and couldn't function as a good dad. But I just got to know now that you know, everything I do is for my boys and for my family too. And one thing I did when I got myself on a good track, this was at the end of 2022, summer of 2022, is connect with the Concussion Legacy Foundation. I actually Googled like foundations to support concussions, and because I actually spoke to some of the local, you know, people here, like doctors and neurologists. Like, there doesn't seem to be much around for, you know, people who are wanting wanting some concussion information, or I remember myself going down a rabbit hole, like jumping to specialists. I didn't feel like there was much around, so I kind of wanted to start my own foundation, but I found Concussion Legacy Foundation, which was established in Sydney, actually early 2022, and it was a foundation that was started in 2007. The big fellow was actually an ex-wrestler, and he suffered a lot of post-concussion symptoms, and he coupled up with a lot of NFL players when there was a lot going on in the NFL. So he started this foundation in the United States, and I feel like they're quite a long way ahead of us, America, what they're doing, because I think NFL, there's a lot coming out in the AFL now. I'm speaking in terms of obviously football, but I think NFL is probably a bit further ahead. That's just only what the research and what I've done, but they're doing a lot of good things too, as we are now too. So part of my role as the ambassador is getting out to sporting clubs. So there's me at the SNFL Women's. So I went out to SNFL, all the SNFL clubs, all the SNFL Women's, Scotch College in Adelaide. That was the bottom right photo, and just getting out and telling my story. But I always, I've had feedback. It always leads with, more of just be aware of concussions, and if you are unlucky enough to have a concussion, just treat it like an injury. Like, if I did my hamstring now, I'd be out for 3 or 4 weeks. If I had that big hit when I was 23, I'd be out for a month. And unfortunately for players, you might feel right, but your brain obviously needs that recovery time. So it's always been well received, my story. I probably fine-tuned it a bit. I probably gave you guys a bit more than I would, obviously at schools. But it's always my main message is just about being safe and treating it like an injury if you do have concussion. The 3 missions of the Concussion Foundation is support athletes and families struggling with concussions and CTE. So I suppose what I was going through. Strive for safe protocols and ensure sports are designed to prioritise athletes' brain health. And I know, working with Your Brain Health, they're doing a lot of this. And, I'd love to end CTE through education, prevention and research. I'm really hoping that, I know I keep referring to my boys, they mean a lot to me. I'm really hoping when they grow up, CTE won't be a thing, because, you guys in this room are doing so much about it. I think, unfortunately, we're going to hear a bit more about it in the next 5 or so years, but I'm really hoping that the next generation, CTE will be a thing of the past, and it'll be, I suppose people from my generation who played, but obviously there's still a lot going on in the media. We heard about the NRL player who was 20, but I'm desperate to help you guys any way I can to really end CTE and concussion injuries. Just not too far to go, sorry. Because this foundation was really new, like I'm not sure if you guys have heard about it, but I decided to start an event last year, and it's going to happen this year. So if any Adelaide-based people, I'd love you to get involved. It's a team-up triathlon where you get a team of 3, you swim, ride and run. It's all, so James could do the swim, I could ride, and then Sue could do the run. You just get involved, get some teams together. And it's all about raising concussion safety and obviously funds for the Concussion Legacy Foundation, which obviously helps them research and put in different education protocols. So that's going to be run again this year. It's actually at West Beach, but it was a pretty cool turnout. Obviously, myself getting around to different sporting clubs last year. We got 1,500 people there last year, which was pretty cool for the first year. So Your Brain Health was there. We had Triple M on board. So I just wanted to mention that's a pretty cool event, which I was really proud of how it all went last year. So that was one of the SNFL women's teams. Seymour College, a girls' school here, they had 10 teams involved, so 30 students. So a pretty cool day. So if you're around in Adelaide in November, love you to get involved and support concussion awareness. I suppose my view on bravery, my previous view was, getting hit and playing on, I used to think that was pretty, I was a bit of a hero, getting smashed in the contest and getting up. I just thought I need to do that for the team. Running into the unknown, that was probably part of my game, backing back into contests and getting back up. I thought that was bravery. But now, and this is what I really emphasise with my talks as well, is a bit being honest with your symptoms. I certainly wasn't honest, but I wouldn't change anything about my career, nothing about the way I played. I know I probably didn't protect myself as well as I should, but I wouldn't change that. All I'd change is being honest about my symptoms, and also speaking up for each other. So if your teammate's not right, I'd kind of make sure I support my teammate and let them know that just treat it seriously too. And just in closing, my hope, I don't know what my future holds, but I think we need to be careful with the diagnosis of probable CTE. I'm on a really good path now, and I question whether I just had post-concussion syndrome. But that probable CTE, I suppose, a message that I could give to some of you today is just be bloody careful with that diagnosis, because we don't know yet, and that really knocked me around getting that diagnosis. I do want to end CT and stop the suffering, but I think we just need to be careful with that diagnosis, because, as I said, I don't know. If I had CT, I'm not sure if I would be in this place. I know I've done a lot of things to improve myself, but I just wish I suppose doctors and clinicians would be a little bit wary with that diagnosis. I think we're doing a really good job striving to get the protocols right. What I'd love to see is I don't know about clubs being fined, but having to go through certain stages of concussion awareness, so they get like concussion approval. I'm just trying to think how I'd explain it. Like you've got RAA approved repairers, like on mechanics. Maybe at sporting clubs have, I coach the Mitcham Hawks, and if my boys play there, you'd have like a concussion protocol certificate or something, so they're safe. They follow the correct protocols. I just think there's more to be done in that line of actually making clubs go through certain trainings and being held to account with the protocols. And I suppose on a personal note, they're my three boys who I love dearly, and I'll just do everything I can to give them a good life and stay on the right track, because there's no way I'm going back to that place. So once again, thank you for having me here, and I'm coming in a place that I feel very, very lucky for where I am. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. I think that's an incredibly powerful story. I've heard it a couple of times, but there's no doubt, Luke, that you're a good husband and a good father and a premiership coach, but you are certainly making an impact and an influence, and we can see that. I've seen you connect with young people when you've given talk at school. You've got a real talent and a gift there, and you're making a huge difference. So we thank you for your time today, and thank you for sharing your story. Right, so we should have Professor Patricios ready to go. Just to remind you, John has been involved in sports medicine practice for over 28 years. He's currently Director of Waterfall Sports in Johannesburg. He's Professor at Wits University in Johannesburg. And he's also the founder and Director of Sports Concussion South Africa, Sports Concussion Consultant to World Rugby. He's a board member of the International Concussion Sports Group and co-chair of the Scientific Committee, and of course lead author in the most recent consensus statement. So hopefully John comes on board. And John, you've got the room, and thank you. And here we go.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, John.
And can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Looking good, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Really, very, very great honor to join this multidisciplinary team at the start of your conference and workshop. It's usually, as James knows, when I join you, I'm saying good afternoon to you, and it's good morning here. But this is one of the rare occasions I can say good morning, and that's because it's 2 in the morning here. But it's really, really good to join you, and having heard Luke's inspiring talk, I know why it was worth being up for this. So I hope I can add as much value. And my brief today is really to talk to you a little bit about the Concussion in Sport group, and in particular, the outputs from the last consensus meeting, which was in 2022 and published in 2023. And I am aware that this is a workshop format that you've put together today, so I don't want it to be too dry and bland, and I've hopefully put together a few clinical pearls which you can incorporate into your discussions through the rest of the day. Those are just some of my disclosures related to work in sport-related concussion. And I thought I'd start by just posing the question as to why it is appropriate that we address this issue of concussion management. And I probably could have left this slide out if I knew what the content of Luke's talk was going to be. But as a clinician, I think there's a few things I always like to bear in mind. The first thing is that concussion is not always an easy diagnosis to make, and it may actually, in the beginning in particular, mimic more serious intracranial injuries. Those might be the spectrum of bleeds that James referred to in his introduction. We've also seen intracranial lesions that occur in sports people and are sometimes dismissed as minor traumatic injuries. Acutely, if not managed properly, particularly after that first blow, there may be a worsening of the player's brain injury, and that might result in cerebral edema, what some people might refer to as second impact syndrome. Very commonly, these injuries affect young players in a learning environment, and because cognition is often affected, it has a significant impact on their lives. We also know now that suffering a concussion will impair performance and increase injury risk, not just risk of future concussions, but musculoskeletal injury risk. And I always use this point as a selling point to coaches and players when I try and keep them back a little bit by saying, if we put you back on the field at this stage, you're firstly not going to perform well, and secondly, you might be lost for the rest of the season through a risk of injury. We've just heard from a player who suffered post-career symptoms and signs, most probably related to his injuries. And we must never forget the potential for chronic neurological and psychological sequelae. And as clinicians, as we know, increasingly that puts us in a medico-legally fraught space. So we have to be wary and make sure that we not only process these cases systematically, but document them as well. Persisting symptoms can be real. They may last for days, but weeks or months in some cases, and they need addressing. And there needs to be a strategy in place. And again, we've just heard how if there is a strategy in place, this can be effective. And finally, I just think we're in a world where concussion is front of mind, and we have to be careful to contextualize it properly, to understand that there's a spectrum of traumatic brain injury, that there are also differential diagnoses, which may or may not be related to that injury. And there are consequences for not treating and treating these appropriately. So if we're going to be good clinicians, then we need to understand all of these. And I think this hopefully contextualizes what we're discussing today. So one of the major focuses of the Concussion in Sports group, which was a very informal group put together in 2002, soon after the first international meeting on concussion in sport. One of the main focuses of CISG is to pull together as much of the research in sport-related concussion and put it into a digestible form, which comes out every 4 years as a consensus statement. It's a summary of the published evidence at the time of that conference. It contains a number of editorials, a methodology paper, 10 systematic reviews, which inform the consensus statement, and a series of what we call new concussion assessment tools, which are clinical guidelines to help clinicians to evaluate and manage concussion. The 2022 process was immense. There were 108 co-authors, 31 expert panelists. There were nearly 80,000 citations that were screened, and eventually about 1,500 full-text reviews included. It was a massive team effort from a scientific and organizing committee, the co-authors, the method authors, the expert panel, and our associate journal, the British Journal of Sports Medicine. Now, this could be a very dry slide, but I put it up here to try and explain that this process is very systematic, quite pedantic, and takes place probably over 4 years, 3 to 4 years in the build-up to the publication of the consensus outcomes. And there's interaction between the organizing committee and the scientific committee. But very importantly, the organizing committee, that consists mostly of sporting associations, is very clearly distanced from the scientific outputs and scientific format of the meeting. They have no input at all to try and avoid conflict of interest. But over the years in the build-up, we followed this quite strict process in terms of developing the scientific outline for the meeting. We also incorporated input from other consensus processes, and we had both our processes and the content overseen by external experts to try and make the process as objective as possible. The conference took place in October 22, and the consensus statement and outcomes were published in June 2023 in BJSM. It was an a priori consensus process, as I mentioned, with external review. The outcomes were based on anonymous voting, and we did include minority alternate points. We put a lot of emphasis on declaration of conflicts of interest, and as you know, in the field of sport-related concussion, there can be many of those. For the first time, we incorporated the athlete's voice, and that's something we need to do increasingly. We also looked at the parasport athlete and considerations for her in terms of how complex it is to diagnose concussions in that environment. And we incorporated the views of a medical ethicist as part of our scientific committee. So these were aspects that were different to previous consensus processes. But ultimately, as clinicians, we're all left with this issue of where a player has suffered an impact and is clearly concussed in terms of brain function that had been significantly disrupted. And how do we take this athlete and not only put him back on the field, but as Luke has eloquently put it, but put him back into life so that there is full operation in terms of his personal life, professional life, etc. And that is the challenge for us. And for that, as I'm going to emphasize, a multidisciplinary team is often very, very useful. So the consensus group came up with this concept of the 12 R's, which headline each of the aspects that we addressed. The first of these, and I'm not going to go through all of them, mostly those that are relevant to our practical discussion, is recognize, or to come up with a conceptual definition of concussion, which you will recognize, that it's a traumatic brain injury caused by a direct blow to the head, neck, or body that results in an impulsive force that's transmitted to the brain and occurs in sport and exercise-related activity. Importantly, this may or may not result in loss of consciousness, and I think that less than 10% of cases does. And also importantly, it is a functional disturbance. So structurally, we often can't see changes, but it's the function of the brain that's altered. And it's that part that we as clinicians, those of you in the room, are largely involved with diagnosing and progressing and managing. I also want to acknowledge the input of a number of our Australian colleagues who were involved, and one of these was Gavin Davis, a neurosurgeon in Melbourne, and Gavin worked tirelessly on many aspects of the consensus process, particularly this evolving definition. Then in terms of reduction, this has become a big focus. How do we help reduce the incidence of concussions or even prevent them? So having systematically reviewed the information that was available, this group, led by Paul Eliason and Carolyn Emery, came up with some very definitive and useful guidelines. They found that particularly in adolescent and child ice hockey, mouthguards played a role. That in sports that introduced policies that limited body contact, that there was a reduced incidence of concussion, and that applied in the practice situation as well. There was work done in rugby union which showed that movement patterns or neuromuscular training, particularly as part of a warm-up, could be useful, and that concussion management strategy policies were critical to reducing recurrent concussion rates. So if you look at those, they're quite simple, and many of the sports you're doing may be implementing those. But as part of this process, I just want to highlight a couple of pearls which I think are easy wins for us involved in sport. The first is the recommendation of mouthguards. It really is a low-hanging fruit because we know that mouthguards help with prevention of dental and orofacial injuries. So if there is a chance that they might help reduce concussions, then we should encourage their use, if not make it compulsory. The neuromuscular training warm-up, there are some nice programs available, and one of those is called Activate, which is freely available on the internet. It's a program developed by World Rugby through the work done by Hislop and Atwood and others who've developed through youth rugby some warm-up programs which actually have been shown to reduce the incidence of soft tissue injuries and concussions. So for me, those are two easy interventions, and we should all be putting concussion management strategies in place and making sure that there's not unnecessary contact at training sessions. And I think if we do those, we go some way to implementing the science that comes out of those consensus processes. In terms of recognizing and removing, which is a catchphrase in concussion management around the world, the key issue is the development of guidelines or tools. And the 6th generation of tools came out in the Amsterdam conference, and those included the SCAT, which you're familiar with. It's the SCAT-6, which evolves from the SCAT-5, and then the new SCOTE-6, which is the Sports Concussion Office Assessment Tool for 72 hours and afterwards. So these tools are quite complex in terms of their development, but in terms of their implementation, they actually are quite easy to utilize. And we'll highlight the important aspects of them here. So if we look at the SCAT-6, which is the new version of the SCAT-5, the Sports Concussion Office Assessment Tool, this is for healthcare practitioners who are working with athletes who may become concussed. It's really an evolution of the SCAT-5 designed to be implemented in 10 to 15 minutes within the first 72 hours optimally following concussion. We've listed here a number of the enhancements from the SCAT-5, and a couple of those is that there is a new an enhanced red flag section. There's an immediate assessment and neurological screen section. The 5-word recall list has been scrapped for a 10-word recall list because of the ceiling effect that was identified. And there's also child SCAT6 for children 12 and under. This is a nice flow diagram which is incorporated for the first time in the SCAT, which gives a good indication of how we manage those concussions and the stepwise processes in terms of implementing the SCAT6. And it is very nicely broken down into sections with new color coding. And some of that color coding has orange sections which probably take a little bit longer and are not compulsory but recommended if possible, and add a little bit more to the SCAT6. It's an evolving version of that SCAT6 which can add further depth to your evaluation. The child SCAT6 again is separately color coded but looks quite similar, and the SCOTE6 is the new kid on the block for clinicians who have the opportunity to manage athletes in an office environment. So this will take 40 to 45 minutes and contains a lot more domain evaluations, if you see those that are listed there. And there are stepwise guides as to how to do this. It is also color-coded into blue components, which are completed only at the first assessment, green sections which are recommended as part of the evaluation, and orange sections which are optional but probably add additional value. So we think this is the most comprehensive multimodal evaluation yet that's been put out and is evidence-based. And if you work an athlete through this, you should glean a very good idea of where her weaknesses lie and where the interventions need to be. So it's a form of diagnosis, but also a form of helping to guide management. Each section has a QR code, which will take you to the instructions or a video to show you how to do this section, for instance, the VOMs in this particular instance. And so if we look at those tools overall, we can divide them into the acute tools, which is the SCAT6, the child SCAT6, and the concussion recognition tool for non-medical personnel, and then post-acute 72 hours and onwards, the sports concussion office assessment tool. So to try and break that down into some clinical pearls, for me it's quite easy. And that is that if you're involved in a sports team, every parent on the side of the field, every referee and every coach should have in his or her pocket the concussion recognition tool. It is very, very important to appreciate that not many club and sports teams have medical support, certainly not with them most of the time. And so the person closest to them is usually the referee or coach and possibly a parent. And so having them be familiar with this concussion recognition tool is very, very important. And then every clinician, healthcare professional, so that means you might be a trainer, you might be a physiotherapist, you may be a doctor, although they're not often doctors with most teams, should be familiar with the SCAT6. This is really the bread and butter of sport-related concussion management, and it's something that should be familiar to most clinicians. They should be able to walk an athlete through that in 10 to 12 minutes. Here's a pearl that's useful, and that is that the CRT6 and the SCAT6 are now available in an app form, an electronic form that you can download for free on your desktop, your tablet, or your smartphone. And there's the link there, freely available. It's a Canadian company that we worked with that has made the original SCAT6 and CRT6 freely available. So very useful to have on your smartphone on the side of the field. We're working with other companies as well. And the only condition is that it matches the original SCAT6 content. And the second is that it's free. We don't allow this to be marketed for commercial gain. Quite often clinicians come to us and they say, you know, the SCOTE6 is very useful and highly comprehensive, but it takes too long for them in a busy practice. So we've come up with some pearls to try and make it a bit easier. Those include making the patient or player complete some of the sections before you see them. So those include their demographic data, injury history and medical history, neuro and psychological history, their symptom scale, and their anxiety, depression, and sleep screens. Also, you can focus your clinical evaluation on the symptom endorsement. If those are more emotional, anxiety related, then you might focus on that. If they're more cognitive, guide your assessment towards that. If they're more balanced in vestibular symptoms, you might be more focused on that. Utilizing a team to assess the athlete also helps. So you can have assistants who might be physiotherapists, for instance, who can help with the balance, gait, and bombs, and certainly in my experience, can add great value in that situation. So this takes a bit of planning, and if you run a concussion clinic, booking follow-ups at specific times when administrative and clinical support are available is a good idea. And then the implementation of that multimodal scope 6 is often very, very efficient and useful. What about technology in the use or in the assessment of an athlete? And I've used different forms of technology over the last 25 years. Some of that is cognitive. Original tools were neurocognitive, which added good value. And some of those now are more vestibular, ocular, and look at some higher function. And I don't think technology is the be-all and end-all. I still think that the key component is a thorough multimodal evaluation. But technology adds significant value in a number of ways. It becomes the visible wound for athletes, coaches, and parents. If you can show them something on a screen that says, this is how you were or how you should be, and this is how you are now, it is quite meaningful to them. And I also think that technology is going to add a lot of value in terms of our rehabilitation. We now know that concussion is a treatable injury. And by identifying domains in which there are deficiencies and incorporating technology to help us manage that, we can utilize technology to move forward. But it needs to be positioned correctly. It's not the sole means by which we make the diagnosis, but incorporated as part of a multimodal clinical evaluation, it can add significant value. So it becomes the visible wound. We can utilize it to monitor recovery, and increasingly we're using it to assist with rehabilitation. Also in the clinical realm, I'm going to talk a little bit about baseline information because this is a pearl. Baseline information is no more than knowing your athlete. And I think there's some useful ideas to incorporate in baseline evaluation. And baseline testing, for those of you who aren't familiar, really means doing an assessment in the uninjured state, usually pre-season. And for me, it's the best time to get to know your athlete. If you know your athlete, then you know when your athlete's injured. It's as simple as that. And this initial step to evaluate an athlete in certain aspects of athlete function is critical. That engagement at the beginning of the season is also an opportunity to educate the athlete on concussion and why it's important, and to bring in coaches and parents into that situation. And it's also their initial contact with a sport-related concussion network. So they now know that there's a go-to person or group that if they suspect there's a concussion, they can work with. And so I do think that the incorporation of baseline testing as part of a strategy is very, very useful as clinicians. Back to the consensus guidelines, and probably the most influential change coming out of the Amsterdam consensus process was the discussion around rest and exercise. And the thinking has changed completely over the last 10 or 15 years from actually resting an athlete in a dark room for several days to now encouraging early intervention with exercise, beginning with activities of daily living and then on a structured exercise program that's used as part of rehabilitation. Also, the limiting of screen time is exactly that. It's limiting and not prohibition, and it's probably for a period of about 48 hours. And we now utilize incorporating daily activities and exercise as a treatment, knowing that this actually facilitates recovery and helps prevent prolonged recovery. And it can be individualized to the athlete. We no longer wait for the athlete to be symptom-free. We allow for minor symptom exacerbations, and we only stop if those exacerbations become severe or the symptoms become prolonged after exercise. And this is the work of John Leddy and his group. And the take-home message here is that you shouldn't be cocooning athletes. You need to be incorporating exercise. And there's some nice work coming out now which suggests a similar approach for cognitive activities, that the earlier you incorporate cognitive activities, the better the athletes do, as long as it's in a stepwise fashion and is monitored. Adequate sleep is an important part of this process, and that sleep should preferably be at night as part of their normal sleep cycle. And if I had to give you a practice pearl, it's the outcome from John Leddy's systematic review. And I use this in athletes and all the time, and with parents who are often very anxious. And I say to them, when we reviewed these data, it showed that there's an average of 5 days faster recovery when you prescribe aerobic exercise early on. So that can save you a school week, which is quite significant. And so we encourage the appropriate use of exercise early on. We also have speculated as to why this might be. And probably the two areas that early exercise affects is the autonomic nervous system. It helps regulate that or correct the regulation of the autonomic nervous system, and it helps psychologically. There's nothing worse for an active person, for an athlete, than to be locked up in a room away from her normal environment where she's engaging with other athletes. And having them at least part of a system where you say, we have now got an approach from early on to get you back onto the sports field when it's safe, that incorporates doing what you like early on, is a really important part of changing a mindset in an athlete, knowing that you have their interest at heart that involves incorporating exercise from early on. The pearls regarding return to learn and return to sport are exactly the protocols which have been described. I think these really are pearls because they give you a framework for a student or for an athlete to return to what they need to do, learn and exercise. So if you look at the 4-step return to learn program from the consensus process, it's very nicely mapped out. And you can sit with a student and customize their program over a few days and say, we know your brain is not ready yet for full lessons, learning, exams, etc. But we actually know that we need to kickstart the process and it's going to be good for you. These are our goals and this is how we're going to work towards them because we know we need to get you back to school full time. Similarly, the return to sport process, if it's mapped out with exercise as an important component in the intervention, we know that it creates a more confident environment that is better controlled. So those first few steps, colored in light blue, are specifically differentially colored because they incorporate exercise as an intervention. The latter part, the athlete has to be symptom-free before they get into sport-specific and contact training. And so it's very nicely divided. And this is evidence-based and, again, can give the coach, the trainer, the parent, and the athlete confidence that they're following a very structured program. What about referring? And we talk about persisting symptoms. Now, this has changed. We don't like to talk about post-concussion syndrome anymore because it creates this perception that you lumped with a syndrome which can't be addressed. Even the subtle use of the term persisting symptoms is different from persistent symptoms because it implies that we can address these, and we think that in most cases we can. So the concussion in sports group defines persisting symptoms as those lasting 28 days or more. But in fact, I think we should be referring into a broader network if we have any concern. And those concerns may be the number of previous concussions. It might be other modifying factors such as concerns about mental health, anxiety, depression, etc. There may be other comorbidities such as, for instance, epilepsy or attention deficit disorder that we need to take into consideration. And in these situations, I think my pearl is really that you should be developing a concussion team with expertise well beyond your own. Now, as the case manager in the center there, you may have expertise in neurology or in sports medicine, but benefit from the input of psychologists, of ophthalmologists, of speech therapists, psychologists. There are such a range of people that we can tap into. And then there's, of course, the athlete's personal team. They're close to their sports coaches, their family, and their academic team. And I think it's important to operate within this network. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have all people in the room, but it does mean, I think, that there should be communication. And because of modern technology, that communication might be remote. So if you're in a small Australian, more rural setting, then I think the possibilities to set up a more extensive network remotely exist. And in fact, we do this internationally. We often consult or give advice to networks that are in other countries. And I think we need to tap into technology, but we need to acknowledge that there is significant input available from disciplines outside of our own. And this, for me, is one of the differentiating aspects of sport-related concussion, is that it is a truly multidisciplinary environment. And when used correctly, it really benefits the athlete. So we should utilize both our real and virtual networks. Luke spoke about long-term or potential long-term effects, and this is a vexing question that is really facing all of us, and it's something that the Concussion in Sport group addressed head-on. These are very complex and very important questions which many athletes post their career face. They are also made more complex by ethical and scientific challenges. The research into these longitudinally is very difficult. But again, this is where an interdisciplinary network or working group can come into being to support the athletes. The Concussion in Sports group and the consensus process examined studies that can look at future health risk. And we looked at issues related to mental health, neurological conditions and diseases, CTE, and in particular, the differentiation between CTE neuropathologic change, which is the pathological post-mortem diagnosis, and traumatic encephalopathy syndrome, which is potentially a syndrome that can exist in an athlete before they die. Now, there were some positives that came out of the systematic review, and that included the fact, or a trend, that actually participating in sports, including contact sport, is overwhelmingly beneficial for athletes from a physical and mental health point of view. And that amateur and professional athletes are not at increased risk of psychological disease or suicide. Unfortunately, most of this research is limited to male athletes, but they don't seem to be, certainly amateur athletes, at risk of neurological or degenerative disease. But there is work coming out of professional American football and soccer players, particularly in Italy, that has raised the flag of an increased risk of neurological disease and dementia. And that's an area that requires attention. But exactly what was very interesting to hear a player or an ex-player say that we must be very careful about diagnosing CTE. And in fact, we shouldn't be diagnosing CTE because it doesn't exist until post-mortem. But we can warn about the issues related to multiple concussions, particularly those that weren't managed appropriately. We can talk about traumatic encephalopathy syndrome, and we can talk about the risks of a post-mortem diagnosis of CTE neuropathological change. But we can also emphasize the fact that following guidance while that athlete is being managed and playing, and correct concussion management implementation will help reduce risk while that player is still active. So that brings us then on to retirement decisions, which fall into a similar realm. When is a player ready to retire? This was a topic that was taken on for the first time by the Concussion in Sports group, and again, led by an Australian, Michael McDeasy, a sports medicine colleague of mine from Melbourne. These are complex decisions. They are also multimodal, multidisciplinary, and multi-time point. It's very rare that an athlete can walk into your office and you make a decision of retirement immediately. These discussions take place over a period of time. They involve the player's greater personal network and their professional network. There are ethical considerations, and often these might take place in a child athlete, where we consider whether having a child play contact and collision sport is appropriate in certain situations. So certainly something to think about. I'm going to end up by talking a little bit about the Concussion in Sports group and where we think it's going. From the 2002 genesis of this group, a handful of clinicians who initiated the Concussion in Sport consensus process. It's now evolved considerably to a global network where we have a board that's registered in the United States as a recognized charity. It's a charitable institution, not for profit, and we meet as a board every month, and we have a mission statement that we try our best to stick to, and that is to enhance the science and practice of health management as it relates to sport-related concussion. So anywhere we can support that, we try and do that. Everybody gives their work free of charge. No one earns any money from the Concussion in Sport group, and any of the outputs from the consensus process are free as well. So we look forward to continuing to evaluate the science, which has evolved, as you know, at a considerable rate, to develop new generations of sports concussion tools, and to try and create a better standard across the world. Now, that incorporates many languages. And so one of the things we've undertaken is to translate the sports concussion assessment tools into different languages. And so far, we've undertaken 15 of these, and these are the ones that are available on the website at the moment. So you can imagine having languages like French, Chinese, and Spanish involved considerably extends knowledge translation, which is something we're working hard on. So if anybody has anything they'd like to talk to the Concussion in Sports group, there's the email address. And we have undertaken interactions with many of you, including the Your Brain Health group, which you've heard about already. And one of the areas I'm quite passionate about is educating clinicians better. And so the Your Brain Health group has been fantastic in initiating a number of courses, which I'd encourage you to partake in. So I'm going to leave you with some resource pearls. Here are some links, some websites, which I think are very useful. They include the Concussion in Sports group as well, our group in South Africa, Sports Concussion South Africa, Your Brain Health group, where the courses can be found. World Rugby has some free education modules which are available on their Athlete Welfare Passport. The University of Calgary has produced a useful MOOC, which is also freely available. All the consensus outputs are available on the BJSM and CISG websites. Free, again, there's a number of podcasts, a video abstract, and some webinars, and the SCAT6 app that I mentioned in the earlier slides. So in a nutshell, I think the pearls for sport and exercise medicine clinicians from the Concussion in Sports process is that you should be able to have a grasp on all of these aspects: prevention, implementation of policy, neuromuscular training, the use of mouth guards, gathering baseline athlete information to know your athlete, implementing multimodal assessments both in the acute and in the office setting, appreciating that the symptoms of concussion might be part of a broader differential diagnosis and not to miss those. Be familiar with the return to learn and return to sport processes. Have an approach to treating an athlete, utilizing exercise, and being able to discuss potential long-term effects and retirement. Tapping into various resources, and of course, establishing your own sport-related concussion network that can help you as a clinician. So I'm going to end it there. I really do appreciate this invitation to this prestigious meeting. Those are my contact details. I really do encourage interaction across the globe, and if we could keep in touch and exchange pearls of wisdom, it would make me a better clinician. So thanks very much for this invitation.
A huge thank you there to Professor John Patricios. They are the clinical pearls that we needed. We're very lucky to have, I was lucky to have met John in South Africa, I think it was 2017, and when he puts his email address, he means it. You can make contact as a virtual resource. We are establishing a global community, so it's a very exciting time. So we're very grateful to have had him speak to us this morning. We've got another local superstar in the room, and that I'm very pleased to introduce Tania Straga, who is our, well, she's a superstar for us because we know we get to a point with our concussions at around that 3-week mark where we see some weird things with vision, we get some weird strange symptoms and some different oculomotor signs. Tania leads up Adelaide Eye Therapy, also works in the public sector with adults and children. One thing I've really noticed is that I've had the lucky opportunity to talk to a lot of people around the world about concussion over the last couple of years, and it's really highlighted how lucky we are to have skilled orthoptists here in Adelaide to be able to check those things. I think we became very aware as neurological physio and vestibular physios a couple of years ago when things get outside our scope, when we see weird versions issues and strange eye movements, that we begin to think, I don't have the skill set or the expertise to know what to do next. And that's why we've been very lucky to be able to refer to Adelaide Eye Therapy, and which has completely transformed our practice in terms of outcomes for our patients, but also having that knowledge that we can refer to people. And yes, probably 10 years ago, I didn't know what an orthoptist was. So please put your hands together for Tania Straga, who will talk to us today about the eyes.
Oh, we can do. Sorry, I've just been told my presentation hasn't been uploaded, so they're in the process of doing that, which should take about 5 to 10 minutes. So maybe some questions.
Well, it is a practical workshop. Has anyone got any questions from the floor around your role? I mean, some of you in this room, I'm sure, would be referring to you guys as orthoptists.
Yeah, look, probably. Probably some people have heard this talk before. I have changed it a little bit. I was going to actually, part of the talk is about how we do things differently as orthoptists. It's not my talk.
Yeah.
Oh, yep. Great idea. Yeah. Oh, there it is.
Looks like it's coming.
Yes.
It's a practical workshop. It feels like a major.
Well, it's hard for it to, well, it is, but it's also hard to make it practical when there's so much information to deliver, isn't it?
Do you think John's good? John's good.
Yeah, that's
Straight
good.
to him.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, yeah. Just
We'll give them a couple of minutes then. Yeah. You know what, they don't get up, they've got to get back down again. Yes, click us here. So you just click that forward, backwards.
Okay, that's it.
And a laser pointer if you want to.
There were some video files, but we're not going to worry about it. I'll just do them. Don't worry about it. It was emailed. That's fine. Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Okay.
There you go. Green light, green.
Excellent.
How have you been? Haven't seen you for ages.
Oh, I know. Really good. Busy. Yeah,
Yeah.
really busy.
Yeah.
Just with work, taking in new staff, training, doing all of that
keeping
stuff. Keeping them, retaining people. It's just challenging. Like, you know, it's challenging.
Yeah.
For all the good reasons, but yeah, looking at expanding into Melbourne. So I think I said that to you
Yeah,
last year,
you
but
did.
actually that's on the cards quite seriously.
Yeah, someone else mentioned it. Maybe you mentioned it from Nicole or someone. Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. So we just need more people local, and that's the challenge is actually recruiting to South Australia for us.
It's really hard, these conversations I have with in the UK, whether it's Sydney, like they don't have you guys.
No. Oh yes. Hi. Hi. Oh yeah. Sure. Oh. Where do you want us here? Thanks.
So you refer a lot to those guys, I imagine.
A huge amount. A huge amount. Yeah.
That's cool. I'm looking forward to this one.
They're fantastic. I've known Nicole for 20 years. We
Yep.
actually worked together when we was in children. So
Okay, that makes sense.
that period of time because of
Yeah, yeah.
audiology and ophthalmology co-located.
I didn't realise, I looked at the website, they've got psychologists.
They do. They have sites. They do a lot of paediatric work, so they understand that auditory processing really quite well because
Yep.
of paediatric work. But now they're expanding into the TBI sort of
Good.
space. So.
Oh God, well, they've had lots of referrals after stay, I think.
Well, I think they will too. I don't know what's latest.
So,
Yeah. Just don't know how to stop it from. How do I pause it? It's actually playing. So it's doing. Okay, I'll just. Oh. Okay. Yep.
we're ready to go. So I get them to sit down.
Yep.
Okay, your standing up time has come to completion. Thank you, and I'll hand over now again to Tania, who can take over.
Sorry, guys, things like that happen. My name's Tania Straga. I'm an orthoptist and director at Adelaide Eye Therapy. So my primary qualification is as an orthoptist, but I also am a qualified genetic counsellor, and so that was my postgraduate qualification. So I'm here today to talk to you about the vision issues we see with concussion and really to make you aware of the bigger picture of a scheme of things that we see. So why orthoptics? We're one of the eye professions, and there are numerous different eye professions, and of course people are familiar with ophthalmology, which is the medical and surgical. Within the eye professions, we are familiar with optometry. Again, they're the primary healthcare professionals, so they're the people we see in community with an eye problem. You see an optometrist for glasses. You would see an optometrist primarily if you had a concern with your vision that might involve pathology, and then they would appropriately be referring to ophthalmology. We know about optical dispensers, so they're people that make up glasses. So once an optometrist has determined a script. And then there's orthoptics. So we're the smallest of the eye professions. There are not very many of us around, but we're very good at talking to ophthalmology and to optometry and optical dispensers, and you know, we all sort of chat amongst ourselves. And here I'm to talk to you about orthoptics as a discipline that you might not have heard about, but that has a really important role to play in rehab. Okay, so what is it that we do? We are the people for disorders in eye movement, visual acuity and binocular vision. So what do those things mean? Eye movement in terms of moving the eyes left to right, up and down, or moving the eyes in to look at an object. Visual acuity being how sharp and clear an object is, whether it's at distance fixation or at near. And binocular vision is the most important part of what we do. So binocular vision is how the brain incorporates vision from one eye and the other eye and makes it a clear, distinct image. Okay, so we look with two eyes, but we decide it's one image that we see. And we're interested in the neurological control of eye function. So you don't go to an orthoptist for a general eye health check. That's what you would go to an optometrist and an ophthalmologist if there's pathology. We're looking at how the eye muscles function and how the eyes move, and it tells us a lot about what's happening within the brain itself. We're the people that prescribe visual aids to improve visual function. So potentially with someone with low vision, we're often prescribing low vision aids. We might be giving magnification devices, we might be giving digital magnification, we might be giving advice around lighting. Likewise, in concussion care, we're doing the same things. And we prescribe lots of different eye exercises, and it's very, very, very specific to the type of vision complaint that the person might have, as to the type of exercises we might prescribe. And we work with a client in terms of optimising their goals with exercises a lot of the time. And we are the guys that facilitate sort of vision rehab. So again, after acquired and traumatic brain injury and in instances of any neurological condition. So it could be anything that's affecting eye movement. It's not specific to concussion. We see people with severe traumatic brain injury. We see people after stroke. We see people with Parkinson's, with MS. Irrespective of what the underlying condition is, we provide the treatment and vision rehab. And we provide advice. So we're sort of the go-to person in terms of allied health to provide advice to other medical professionals in terms of what a person's visual complaint, how it might impact on their return to work, how it might impact on their return to play or a team sport. And we will often be the people to explain a vision problem to a patient as well. So a lot of the time people come to us having been diagnosed with something but not really understanding what that means. We communicate with that client, we communicate with their family and with the treating team. So what do? We work really collaboratively. We are not silos, particularly with ophthalmologists and with optometrists. And again, eye people are really good at talking to each other. We sort of all chat amongst ourselves because we understand eyes, but we understand a different part of the visual system. So each of us has a very succinct role. And increasingly, we're starting to talk to the other disciplines. So hopefully, from the talk today, you'll have a better understanding about what an orthoptist does and what our role is in concussion care. A little bit on the history, because everyone goes, oh, wow, this is a new profession. Not really. It's been around for a really long time. And it started in France in the 19th century. And the very first orthoptist was in 1920s in London. And Mary Maddox was her name. She was trained by her ophthalmologist father, and her training specifically in binocular vision disorders. Her father was a strabismologist, so he operated on eye muscles. So when people had an eye that pointed in or pointed out, he was the one that did that surgery, but he trained his daughter as an orthoptist. And the very first clinic was actually in London in 1928, but Australia's claim to fame is we were the second clinic, so 1931 at the Alfred. So again, in terms of a major trauma centre, that's where the first clinic in Australia was. As it stands today, the largest employer of orthoptists is the NHS. So I don't know how many, but every major hospital service has orthoptists employed. And the reason we're such a small profession, particularly in Australia, is there are only 2 training schools. So one in Victoria, one in New South Wales. Both offer bachelor and master's courses in orthoptics. And we work in various settings. So orthoptists don't just work in community. We actually predominantly work in hospital settings, and I have a public appointment at the Women's and Children's Hospital, as well as working in private practice. But most orthoptists would be working somewhat in public health and then also working in private practice. And the private practices can be standalone orthoptic practices or more commonly within ophthalmology. So orthoptists really work side by side with ophthalmologists in that sort of secondary healthcare setting. Many work in low vision, so working with organisations like RSB, Vision Australia, the Royal Society for the Blind, guide dogs. And in rehab settings, so eastern states, we have orthoptists working in acute rehab post-injury. Unfortunately, not in South Australia. Again, there are not enough of us to be working in that setting, but I think it would be a wonderful thing. We have orthoptists working in community health, in screening, so in vision screening, in diabetic eye disease screening, in glaucoma screening, so a range of different areas. A lot working in clinical research and certainly in the universities. And there's only 900 of us sort of registered in Australia. So it's a really, really quite small profession. And of those 900 registered, there's 25 of us in South Australia. So we're a super niche area in eye health care, but even within that niche, we're a really, really very small group. So that's just a bit of a background so you understand the differences between the eye health professions and what we do. And what are some of the common things we see with concussion? So as an orthoptist, you know, what is it that people are coming in and reporting? Now, very occasionally people will report a transient loss of vision, which can happen at the time of the injury, or it might be that they've experienced that even very soon after the injury. Very commonly blurred vision, just in general. My vision is blurry, whereas it wasn't previously. Double vision is certainly very, very common, and it doesn't have to be constant. It can be that it's double vision when a person looks at something at close range. It can be that it's double vision when they look to extremities of gaze. It can be double vision when they look to far distance. They might not report difficulties with vision, but they might say reading's challenging. So they might just sort of report that reading previously was something they enjoyed to do and they no longer can do or enjoy doing. They can report visual motion sensitivity, and again, that's a really big indicator that there might be something going on with the vision system. Nausea and dizziness. Again, it's not a vision complaint, but certainly we know that some of those people that we see in practice that have difficulties with their vision will report nausea and dizziness that is related to their visual complaint. A really big one is headache and eye strain, and the very typical headaches that we see sort of associated post-concussion with vision symptoms are frontal, temporal, the eyes themselves, the orbits, and sometimes occipital. So it'll sort of be that whole kind of region radiating back to the visual cortex. People might report poor depth perception. They might not say their vision's blurry or difficult, but they might say they find it difficult judging where things are in space. Or they might not even tell you that it's difficult judging things, but they're suddenly tripping up on things that they wouldn't have previously tripped up on. Or they might misjudge things as they go to grab for something and knock over, glasses of water, or misjudge as they're pouring a cup of tea. And the other really big one, and most of you would have experienced this with clients coming in, but is photophobia, so light sensitivity. Again, it's really very common in the very acute stages, but we also unfortunately see it with people with persistent sort of concussion symptoms. And I will just touch on this visual snow. It's a kind of an area that's emerging in terms of eye health and what we understand, but it is another symptom that people can experience, and it's a disruption to the visual processing pathways, and I will talk about that a little bit more. So, the visual system is really complex. We all know that. It starts from the front of the head and extends all the way to the back. The very first part of the visual system is really the eyes themselves, and we know the eyes themselves are generally not injured during concussion. So it's important that if someone is reporting symptoms with vision, that we do actually have them assessed by an optometrist and potentially an ophthalmologist, because we actually want to know that the eye health itself is not affected, that it's not a problem of physiologically the eye. If the eye health is fine, we then start to think about what else it might be that's going on that's giving somebody symptoms. And it can extend anywhere from the optic nerve, the optic radiations, down to the visual cortex. So a concussion injury can cause an injury in any one of those areas. There's no specific area that's impacted. And so it's no wonder that concussion can lead to a range of symptoms and signs in people. So what's the common thread? A really high portion of people after concussion report visual symptoms. The first reference there is from a group at Macquarie University, so Professor Claire Fraser's group. Claire Fraser actually works really closely with Rowena Mobbs, and they've collaborated on a number of papers. They are looking at rugby players post-concussion. So a lot of their research is coming out from what people experience with vision with concussion after rugby injuries, and it's about 70%. So a really high portion will have some form of visual complaint. The other thing we know, though, is of those that do have those complaints with vision, we know that optimal diagnosis and then treatment of those vision symptoms is really essential to reducing the impact for a return to school, return to work, and return to daily living. So if we ignore those things and don't treat them, treatment is not going to be as good, and people are not going to be able to return to normal function as quickly as they should be able to. So what are some common signs of vision being impacted after concussion? Well, certainly a really easy one is that you've got reduction in visual acuity, so how sharp someone's vision is for far distance, and occasionally how sharp someone's vision is for near, and it might be that it's quite disparate, so it's not necessarily going to be across the range of distances, it might just be for one or the other. We look at pupils because pupils tell us a lot about neurologically what might be going on, and we might get some anisocoria, so that's a difference in pupil size. It can tell us about the visual system. It can also tell us about migraine activity, so we often see that with migraine as well. We certainly see an impaired VOR, and again, the physios will talk about this much more. We pick it up as orthoptists. It's something that we look at, but it's not something that we treat. We treat other aspects of the visual system. We can see a slowness or reduction in eye movement. So it might be that the person themselves is unable to quickly move their eyes into particular gaze positions. We certainly see impaired convergence, and it's a really very common thing. I'll go on to talk about a little bit more, but convergence is the way the visual system, the human visual system, moves to look at a near object. And hand in hand with that, we see impaired accommodation. And accommodation is what we do when we look to a near object. We focus appropriately for a set distance. And then we see decreased visual attention. So sometimes it'll just be that people are not wanting to engage in visual activities because their visual processing has been affected. So what's the aim of orthoptic treatment? It's probably the same aim that you all have in your various disciplines, but really we're aiming to return people to normal daily function. And we really want people to be able to care for themselves. We want people to be independent. We want them to be able to mobilise. We want them to be able to drive because that's a big part of independence. So reading, driving, all of those sorts of things. And if vision is impacted, the real reality is that a lot of the time people can't get back to those very basic things safely. Then the next part of our treatment is looking at how we would return someone back to school or to work. So if we've sort of successfully treated the visual system in terms of complaints for tasks of daily living, it's then, okay, the next step is how do we get them back to meaningful employment and to work? And then at the end of that is how do we return someone to sport and other activities that they might enjoy? And we know that eye and vision therapy actually greatly accelerates someone's process through that rehab journey. So it can really completely alleviate symptoms in the majority of patients with post-concussive vision symptoms, and particularly those with oculomotor deficits. And failing to recover. So if we haven't picked up these things that haven't been treated correctly, or we've failed to recover from some of these vision problems, it actually really greatly elevates a person's risk of further injury, okay, for various reasons, but the main one being they can't see well enough to do some of those things they want to be able to do, which is really important for driving. It's really important for contact sport as well. So we don't want further injury because someone's vision symptoms haven't been treated accurately. I'll talk a bit about accommodation because as eye people, we talk about accommodation a lot of the time, and I think you guys probably sitting there are thinking accommodation is, booking into the hotel. It's not when it comes to eyes. So accommodation is a normal visual system, and it's the ability to shift our focus of the eye to maintain a clear image of an object. Now, when we look at an object at near, we relax our accommodation when we look to a far object, so our visual system has to sort of adopt a relaxed position. When we look to something at near, we have to exert accommodation to be able to see something sharply and clearly. And it requires afferent input to the visual cortex, the brainstem, to control the eye movement and to fibres within the ciliary muscle, which is a muscle that sort of sits around the human lens, and it contracts and expands in terms of controlling the human lens to appropriately focus. It's a super complex system. So it's really, in terms of accommodative problems, they're things that we see really commonly after concussion because an injury to any part of the head can give you a problem with accommodation. And what people will report is blurred vision, headaches and eye strain, which we refer to as asthenopic symptoms, but headaches and eye strain sort of come about because the person's trying really hard to be able to focus and they just can't do it, so there's a lot of effort involved. And difficulty with reading or with relaxing focus at distance. In terms of the types of headaches related to accommodation, it's not the type of headache someone would wake up with in the morning. It's a type of headache that generally develops with vision tasks. So if they're trying to read or if they're trying to concentrate on watching a particular show on TV or whatever, something that's required some accuracy, we'll find that those types of headaches would come on, and they are really centred to the frontal, the temporal, the eye, the sockets and the occipital lobe. And the really important thing for non-eye people to know is that our ability to accommodate actually changes as we age. So it's something we have to take into account as orthoptists. Now, when we talk about accommodation, we talk about people that are young being able to accommodate, and fortunately that means anyone that's under the age of 45 is considered young when it comes to eyes. As we approach 45 and above, we actually naturally start to lose the ability to accommodate, and that's why everyone generally starts to need reading glasses, right, once they get over that age. So we need to know what is normal accommodation for someone's age, and that's what we're working to try to get someone back to doing. It's very age dependent, and it's also very dependent on what someone's actual refractive error is, so whether that person wears glasses for distance fixation. So that's accommodation. This is how it works, and it's just a really sort of very simple diagram to show you, but essentially at the top we've got what the human lens does when we look at a close object, and you can sort of see it expand as it tries to focus on an object. So that's those little muscles, the ciliary muscle that sort of sits around the human lens that moves to make that movement in the human lens. And then when we look at a distance object, we can see down the bottom there the lens is nice and relaxed, and that's as the ciliary muscle kind of relaxes to be able to look at something accurately at far distance. There are lots of disorders of accommodation, so there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to concussion. We see a myriad of things happening after concussion, but I'll talk about the three most common. And certainly insufficiency. So an insufficiency of the accommodative system or accommodative insufficiency is suddenly the inability to be able to focus appropriately at near distance. So people often report blurred vision trying to read, whereas previously they could read quite well. The next thing we see quite commonly, sorry, it's not coming up. Oops. Is infacility. Now, infacility is actually the inability to shift your focus quickly and accurately. So it might be that there's a lag in being able to look at an object and make it sharp and clear. The person might look at a far distance object, it not be clear, and then they clear it, and then they go to look at something close up and the same happens. So they can make those appropriate accommodations for distance, but it's slow. And the third one is spasm, and this is really very common in a very young population. So if we're talking about sport and what we see post-concussion with sport, actually we see accommodative spasm really quite commonly. And it's when the visual system or the accommodative system goes into overdrive. And so what the person starts to do is accommodate and exert that additional focus in excess of what's normal. And typically what we would see there is that people would report clear, sharp vision at a very set distance, and they might walk in and they'll say, I see everything clear at 50 centimetres, but everything before 50 centimetres is blurry, everything behind 50 centimetres is blurry. And it's just as that ciliary muscle can't release the focus, it's set for that one distance, and it can't let go too far and it can't exert additional for near. So that's really common in the younger populations. And then we'll move to treatment. So I'm not sure. Okay, half the slides are working, the other half are not. Okay, so in terms of how we treat them, so it's very specific again to the type of visual complaint that that the person's experiencing. We use flippers, and they're that little picture right at the top. You can see the sort of colour coordinated. They're a series of different lenses. They're plus and minus lenses. So a plus lens relaxes accommodation when we get a person to look through it, and a minus lens teaches the person to exert accommodation. So if a person has accommodative insufficiency or difficulty with exerting a correct amount of focus, we work with these lenses to teach them how to start to do it appropriately again. And we generally start from something that's quite easy to do. The person would work with this at home, teaching themselves how to relax and exert accommodation. As they get better doing it for a particular lens level, we then increase it up to the next one until we get to the desired level for their age. And again, it's very age dependent. We also work on simple things. So sometimes we're presented with your children. So flipper exercises are a bit challenging with a child, but an accommodative rock exercise is much simpler. And it's a really very simple thing to do. It's that little diagram down the bottom. It's a task that we set up at 3 metres. So we have someone looking at nonsense letters at 3 metres, but they're replicated nonsense letters at 30 centimetres. And what we do is we ask the person to look to the distance object, read that out loud, then look to the near, read it out loud. And they go backwards and forwards between distance and near. And each time they're trying to make it clear quicker than the time before. So we're trying to go really quite quickly through that chart, and again to teach their visual system how to appropriately accommodate. Now occasionally we have to go for the big guns, and the big guns are drops. So for some people, particularly those that might have a spasm of accommodation, again I mentioned that's actually something that's quite common in the younger population. Sometimes they're so stuck in that spasm that we actually do need to refer that person on to an ophthalmologist for cycloplegic drops that that person might use for a week. We've actually got someone retreating at the moment that's been using those drops for 2 months, so that completely relaxes their accommodative system. And it's got to that point of that person needing it for 2 months because they had an accommodative spasm that had gone on for 6 years. So we see this commonly immediately post-concussion, but it's also something chronically people can carry with them and not have had treated appropriately. And then we also prescribe reading magnification. Sometimes people really did need reading glasses before they had their concussion, you know, and it's just come to a head after their concussion. So we might also just sort of counsel them around what is appropriate for someone's age, and that reading glasses are not so bad if you are over 45. The next visual system is convergence, and convergence, a bit like accommodation, is probably the second most commonly thing that we sort of see affected in terms of after concussion. Convergence is the simultaneous movement of both eyes to look at a near fixation target. So when we look at something at close, not only do we have to exert focus, but our eyes need to coordinate to be able to look at that object as one clear, distinct image. And again, multiple cortical areas are involved in this function. So we've got the cortex, we've got the parietal lobe, we've got frontal eye field, supraocular motor area, and the cerebellum. It's complex. So again, concussion can lead to problems of convergence just because it doesn't matter what part of the brain is injured in any injury when it comes to eyes. We can get a problem with convergence irrespective. And as I mentioned, convergence works really closely with accommodation. So not only do we have to focus appropriately, we need to be able to converge and move our eyes appropriately for that set distance to look at an object as a single object and as a clear object. And it's commonly found. So symptoms, what do we see with someone that might have a problem with convergence? Certainly double vision for near work is the main one that people would report. Sometimes they won't mention double vision, but they'll say things are blurred because they haven't actually worked out that it's double that they're appreciating, but it's sort of overlapping. Again, headaches are really very common with this, and eye strain. So those same sort of symptoms we see with accommodation. So really with this, it's impossible for someone to tell whether a person has a problem with accommodation or convergence without doing an assessment because the symptoms overlap. What the person is reporting overlaps. How do we treat it? A bit like the accommodative problems where we teach people to start to accommodate again, we teach people how to converge again. And so there's some really simple exercises that we teach people to do called convergence exercises. The simplest one, and I know sometimes we get people in and they've already started doing some of these things with their treating clinicians, is simple convergence. So just tracking a pen through space in towards the nose and back out again, or jump convergence, and the Brock string, if people are familiar with that, that's a really common jump convergence exercise. It's one of those that are taught in the very early stages. We also teach vergence exercises. So vergence is the ability to move the eye in a particular amount. It's a measurable amount. So as orthoptists, everything we do is very objective. We take measurements each time we see someone. They're all objective measurements. We are listening to what people are telling us and their symptom reporting, but it needs to match up with what we see objectively and from a clinical perspective. And so we can teach people with little prism lenses how to make appropriate convergence movements. They can't go from not being able to converge at all to being able to converge normally overnight, but we can teach them in a really graded way how to do it appropriately with prisms. We also use stereograms, and they're the 3D sort of, they're a 3D tool, a bit like a magic eye book. If anyone's sort of born before 1980, you probably remember that. They're sort of schematic diagrams that sort of jump out at you from a page. They're a more complex form of a stereogram. We use really simple stereograms to teach people what normal physiological double vision is, because there is double vision that's normal. We all see it, but our brain ignores it. We teach people what that is, and by teaching them what that is, we can teach them how to better accommodate. We can teach them how to better converge. So it's a graded exercise. We start with simple and we grade up to more complex as people improve. Saccades. Everyone knows saccades are affected, right? After concussion, we see a decrease in accuracy with speed. What is a saccade? A saccade is just a movement from one object to another. So it's you looking at one object, deciding you want to look at that object, and then looking at the next object with some accuracy. So that can be visually guided, can be an anti-saccade, so looking in the opposite direction of something, can be memory guided, can be predictive, and again, the pathways involve multiple cortical areas, so saccades are typically affected after concussion because it doesn't matter where the injury is. And it's particularly vulnerable to impact following concussion. So what do we see with saccades? We can see that there's increased time. So there's a lag in terms of making a saccade. It can be a slowed down movement. It can be that from when the person decides to make that movement to actually being able to make that movement is slow, but the actual saccade itself is slow. It can be a lack of coordination. It can be hypermetric. So it can be that the person makes a movement, but it's just short of where that object is. And so what does it mean for a person that's got impacted saccades? But again, same sort of thing, difficulty with reading, difficulty with scanning a visual environment. It makes vision really effortful. So looking from one object to another, if you can't do it accurately, is really fatiguing and really effortful. And it's a really useful thing that most people can do post-concussion to work out whether the visual system has been impacted. And it's really commonly impacted. So if you can't test anything else, you can look at a saccade by going, look at this pen, look at that pen, and looking at what the accuracy is as the person's doing that. I did mention baseline assessment there because typically, as orthoptists, we don't have any baseline assessment. People are coming to us with a problem, and we would love baseline assessment. We would love to have seen that person before to be able to then compare to what it is they're able to do now. This is where some of these newer sort of technologies coming in are really beneficial. If people have had baseline assessment, which does look at their saccades, looks at their vergence, looks at convergence, looks at their accommodation, it's really valuable information for us to know what their baseline is so that we know what we're working towards, what their goal is. If we don't, we're making assumptions. So as an orthoptist, I'm making assumptions on what someone's normal baseline would have been pre-concussion to be able to work towards that. So having some objective data is actually really useful. That was a really quick video. I don't know if it's going to play again. I'll just see, sorry, in terms of how a saccade is made. You can just sort of see the eye movement. So looking from one object to the side, looking to the other, making an accurate movement, although that wasn't that accurate. This is a 4-year-old child, but generally speaking, we're looking at accuracy, speed, amplitude. The next system is smooth pursuit. Now, smooth pursuit is a tracking eye movement, so it's commonly sort of what people sort of would talk about, tracking an object through space, so smoothly looking at an object as it moves. And the object of a smooth pursuit movement is actually keeping that central vision centralised on the fovea. And the fovea is the part in the macula that does our very fine detailed work. We want objects to remain on the fovea. If they're moving outside of the fovea, we're going to have quite inaccurate vision. So being able to make a nice smooth movement usually means that we've got nice clear vision as we're moving our eyes. A difficulty with this might be representative as if people finding it difficult tracking something through space. So if it's a ball that's travelling at speed, or if it is that it's a car as it tracks through space, or just you talking to a person and moving your hands and they sort of can't really watch that object moving as quickly as they would otherwise. Typically we'll find people have difficulty with hand-eye coordination when it comes to smooth pursuit. So if you think about playing cricket, watching a ball sort of moving towards you, and you go to hit the ball, but you've just misjudged because your smooth pursuit system is impacted, you're actually not going to be able to hit very well, okay, with much accuracy. And it's really something that's required for safe driving and return to play. So return to play for those reasons, because of the accuracy, but again for driving. We make so many complex eye movements when we're driving. If we've got impacted smooth pursuit, if we've got impacted saccades, it makes driving unsafe. And we have lots of conversations with people that they might make legal requirement for driving from a vision perspective, being able to see clearly. But if their eye movement is impacted, we know that the real world implication is that they're not safe to drive. I'll briefly talk about ocular motility deficits. So again, as orthoptists, because we're looking at eye movement, we commonly see problems with the way people move their eyes. And the chief complaint that we'll see with this is double vision. So double vision, not like it was with convergence, but it'll be double vision that's there often constantly. So a person's had a concussion injury and they've got constant double vision that presents. We see it very commonly in severe traumatic brain injury. And again, we work with a range of people coming in, concussion being one of the things, but we see lots of people after car accidents and serious injuries where they've had a severe traumatic brain injury. Double vision really overrepresents in terms of the symptoms that would be reported. And that's because commonly the nerves that are responsible for eye movement are impacted. So we've got the third, the fourth and the sixth cranial nerve. All of those nerves control eye movement. We have 6 muscles in each eye that control eye movement, so we've got 12 eye muscles in total, and if you can imagine, even one of those being impacted is going to give double vision. So really commonly in terms of what we see with traumatic brain injury, again, irrespective of whether it's concussion or more serious traumatic brain injury, we can get a fourth cranial nerve palsy. Again, very, very common. People will describe sort of vertical separation of images that's there all of the time. So we see these deficits. We can actually treat these deficits in clinic on the day. So not only are we doing assessments and looking at what the person's problem is, but we're looking to see whether we can provide a real life benefit to that person on the day. And often we're actually fitting them with prism lenses to their glasses, for example, which means that they're walking out of clinic with no double vision, whereas they walked in with constant double vision on the day of the appointment. So really big impact in terms of safety. We also see it commonly with orbital bone fractures, and I just talk about this a bit because we talk about concussion, but sometimes actually some of those structural changes haven't been looked at. So often people have had MRI brain, they've had CT brain, they haven't had MRI orbits and they haven't had CT orbits, and those fine fractures are not picked up. Now, if there are fine fractures in the orbital bones, we can get entrapment of orbital contents and of the muscles, and so we can get structural problems from something that hasn't been looked at in detail. An orthoptic assessment does look at that though, so often we're then giving advice that, okay, now it's time to do MRI orbits. We've done the brain's fine, but let's have a look if there have been some structural changes to the orbits themselves. And I will briefly touch on this. I've only seen 2 of these in 21 years, but a central fusional disruption can happen with any sort of brain injury. What that means is after the brain injury, the person can no longer fuse 2 images. So it might look like they've got normal vision in either eye. It looks like the eyes move quite well. There isn't a nerve palsy. There's nothing there that explains their symptoms. But suddenly they've got overlapping images. So their brain can no longer decide that one image and the other image that they see with either eye is the same image. And so the images become stacked, or they sort of dance around each other. So that's not impossible. That is something that we see in clinical practice, and it is permanent. Very briefly, so photophobia, most of you again would have had patients coming in with photophobia after concussion. It's very common in the acute stages. What do we do? So what is it? It's a dislike of bright or artificial light. Typically people will talk about digital devices being activating, fluorescent lighting being activated, so think of Coles and Woolies. Coming into medical appointments also, we use lots of fluorescent lighting in hospitals and clinics. And they might tell you that they struggle on an overcast day, which is really interesting because you don't think of that as being, exposure to light. But actually an overcast day can be worse than a really bright sunny day. And it's as the light's dispersed through cloud and through particles, it scatters. So it can be more activating for a person than a bright day. We can use neurological tints. So there's very specific neurological tints that we can prescribe to a person that is photophobic. Generally, we won't do it in the very acute stages, but we can do it if there's some persisting symptoms and we're trying to encourage a person to enter back into community. It's very specific to the type of problem that the person has, so there's no one-size-fits-all in terms of neurological tints. It's trial and error, we try different things. And then we actually provide advice to that person's optometrist into which tint it would be beneficial to incorporate into a pair of glasses. And we can do this really inexpensively. So these are not custom glasses that are, $2,000. They're $200 from Specsavers if we can, get the right ones. So they're a really quite cost-effective solution for a lot of people. And what we don't want, and particularly, months after concussion, is people coming into clinic wearing dark sunglasses and noise-cancelling headphones. And really, up until recently, and I'm going to say in the last few years, this was still common practice. We would call people in from the waiting room and have them sitting in there with dark sunglasses on because they were so sensitive to light. Often it was because they'd been given the incorrect advice in the early stages. They were told to wear sunglasses because they were light sensitive. What happens after wearing sunglasses, and particularly indoors where ambient lighting isn't that bright, is you further sensitising someone to light. So we really don't want to further sensitise someone where they're already sensitive. We want to desensitise them. And the way we do that is by using tints that block particular wavelengths of light but still allow light into the eye. It's really important that we are still exposing people to light, natural daylight. I will talk about visual snow. I'm not sure if many have heard about it. Again, this is a common thing that we see after concussion. Less common than the other things, but certainly it's quite reported. And what it is, it's tiny sort of flickering dots that people see. And they'll report it as being static. If you think about old TV screens and the static you would see on a screen late at night or whatever it was, they sort of see it, these tiny sort of flickering dots, and they see it with one eye, they see it with the other eye, they see it with both eyes open, and it's there across their visual field. It's not just one particular area. Often it's only one area, then we've got to think about pathology within the eye, or we can think about visual migraine, but visual snow is everywhere. They see it everywhere they are, and it can fluctuate. There can be periods where it's particularly problematic for a person, then it can be periods where they don't notice it so much. It's superimposed on top of an image, so they'll still see what they're looking at, but they'll see this snow in front of what it is that they're looking at. And interestingly, visual acuity is usually not affected. So if we go to test a person's vision, they're still getting normal vision on the chart. And their peripheral field's not affected. So if you sit them in front of a field analyzer, they've still got normal, full fields. It commonly coexists, in terms of what we see with vision, it commonly coexists with light sensitivity, with night blindness or difficulty in night situations, with after images that people will describe, with floaters in vision and with photopsias. And the other interesting thing, there's not just the vision that's sort of impacted. With visual snow, we actually find these people often report the high frequency tinnitus, migraine, anxiety, tremors. Okay, so that's kind of the clinical presentation that we're expecting with visual snow. And just a quick visual to give you a bit of an idea. We've got on the left is a picture of an after image, as someone might see it. So they see an object, but they still see that object as it's moved. So they're still seeing the images of that object as it's moved through space. And then likewise with visual snow, you can see on that right-hand side, we've got that visual snow superimposed on top of the image. So they still see things, but they see it with interference. That's the end of my talk. It was actually really hard to try to fit 45 minutes of information about the visual system. Hopefully it's a bit of an overview in terms of the typical things that we see as an orthoptic practice, and for you to understand that vision isn't just about what people see on the eye chart. And typically if people are reporting visual symptoms but have seen an optometrist and have been reported to have normal vision but they're still reporting symptoms, please refer them. Optometrists are wonderful, and we work with so many different optometrists, but they really don't look at eye movement in the same detail that orthoptists do. Okay, thank you.